What would you do if your seat on a flight was taken without notice? How would you react when the airline claims it's a mistake, only to reveal something much deeper? Join Jessica Davis, a determined CEO, as she fights back against an unjust system on a flight from New York to Los Angeles. Will she get the respect she deserves? Find out in this intense, gripping story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to TH Voices of the Underdog for more. It had been one of those weeks, endless meetings, emails that never seemed to stop, and conference calls that stretched into the night. Jessica Davis, the CEO of a successful tech company, was exhausted. So when the opportunity to fly to Los Angeles for a much-needed break came up, she grabbed it with both hands. She had worked hard to get to this point in her career, and she deserved some time to recharge. Jessica didn't usually travel like this. After all, she was always on the go, always working, but this time she treated herself. She splurged on a first-class ticket, not for the luxury, but because she needed the space, the comfort, and most importantly, the silence. She had booked the seat weeks ago, double-checked her reservation, and looked forward to the peace and quiet that awaited her. As she walked toward the gate at New York's JFK Airport, she felt a flicker of relief. Soon, she would be able to shut her eyes, lean back, and forget about the stress of running a company, at least for a few hours. She found her way to the first-class boarding area, her heart lifting at the sight of the spacious cabin ahead. No more cramped rows of seats, no more bumping elbows with strangers. Just her, a window seat, and the hum of the plane's engines. When her group was finally called to board, Jessica was practically beaming. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, her fingers eager to get onto the plane. A warm smile from the gate agent only added to her anticipation. She was ready for her well-deserved break. Stepping into the aircraft, she followed the first-class aisle. The seats, arranged in pairs with just enough space between them to make her feel like she was in her own private world, welcomed her. She checked her seat number once again, 3A, and made her way toward it. But as she approached, something didn't feel right. Her seat was occupied. The man in 3A, middle-aged, sharply dressed, with salt and pepper hair, was lounging comfortably in her seat, completely oblivious to her presence. He sat back, reading a newspaper as if he were right at home. Jessica stopped in her tracks, her brain quickly processing the situation. This couldn't be happening. She had confirmed her seat weeks ago. She had paid for it. And yet there he was, acting like he owned the place. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe you're in my seat." The man didn't even glance up. Instead, he continued flipping through the newspaper, unfazed. After a moment of silence, he finally lowered the paper, looking at her with a slight smirk. "I don't think so," he replied, his voice uninterested, as though this kind of thing happened every day. "This is my seat." Jessica blinked, confused and a little frustrated. She wasn't the type of person to back down, especially when she knew she was right. "I'm afraid not. This is my seat," she said, extending her boarding pass to him. "See, I'm 3A." He took the boarding pass, glanced at it briefly, and shrugged, clearly uninterested. "I've been told to sit here," he said, as if that was the end of the discussion. That was it. He wasn't moving. Her mind raced for a moment. What was happening? Did the flight crew make a mistake, or was there something more going on? Either way, she wasn't going to back down, not without an explanation. "Look," she said, trying to remain calm, "I paid for this seat. I confirmed it, and now you're sitting in it. I need you to move." This time, he looked up from his paper and gave her a bored look. "I told you I'm not moving. They told me to sit here. It's not my problem," he said, a shrug of indifference spreading across his shoulders. He went back to his paper. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about respect, about being treated like she mattered, like her time mattered. She had worked hard for this flight. She deserved this. And now this man, this stranger, was treating her like she was the one out of place. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. "I'd like to speak with a flight attendant," Jessica said, her voice now sharp. The man didn't respond. He was already lost in his newspaper again, ignoring her completely. The cabin was starting to fill up with the sound of murmurs as other passengers noticed the situation unfolding. Some glanced over, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said anything. Jessica felt their eyes on her, but she didn't let it faze her. This was about more than just this one seat. It was about standing up for herself, not letting anyone, no matter who they were, walk all over her. It wasn't long before a flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s named Sarah, walked up to Jessica. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, offering a polite smile. Jessica didn't mince words. "Yes, this man is in my seat and he refuses to move. I've paid for 3A and I need him to vacate it." Flight attendant Sarah looked at the man, who gave her a lazy smile and waved a dismissive hand. "It's no big deal," he said. "I've been told to sit here." Sarah looked back at Jessica, her face still smiling but with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Davis," she said, using Jessica's last name as if she recognized her, though Jessica didn't know why. "There's been a system error with the seating arrangements." "A system error," Jessica repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What does that even mean?" The flight attendant hesitated before replying, her voice a little quieter. "There's been a reassignment of seats, but don't worry, I'll get it sorted out right away." Jessica's grip on her boarding pass tightened. A reassignment. This didn't feel right. She had a paid first-class seat and someone else was sitting in it. This wasn't a mistake, this was something deliberate. "I don't think you understand," Jessica said, her tone now firm and cold. "I want to know who made this change. And where my new seat is." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure who exactly made the change. I'll have to check with the flight manager." "Then get the flight manager," Jessica said. She wasn't going to back down now, not when she knew something wasn't right. Now. The tension in the air was palpable. The quiet hum of the plane's engine seemed distant as Jessica stood at the entrance to 3A, her eyes locked on the man who had taken her seat. He was still sitting there, oblivious to the growing unease around him, his newspaper spread wide in front of his face. A smug, uninterested look plastered on his face. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, the weight of their attention pressing on her shoulders. But Jessica wasn't about to back down. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She wasn't one to be intimidated, not by anyone, and certainly not by a man who thought he could take her seat with such arrogance. "Excuse me," she said again, this time more firmly, though still trying to remain calm. "I told you this is my seat. Please move." The man didn't even flinch. He didn't acknowledge her at all, keeping his gaze firmly on the pages of his newspaper. It was as if she didn't even exist. This was ridiculous. Jessica's fingers tightened around her boarding pass. She had paid good money for that seat. She wasn't going to let some random person take it from her without any explanation. She cleared her throat, speaking louder this time. "I'm not asking again. I need you to get up. This is my seat." Still, the man barely reacted. He shifted slightly, just enough to make it clear that he wasn't moving and wasn't planning to. "Look, lady," he said dismissively without looking up. "They told me to sit here. Not my fault, okay?" Jessica felt her patience start to wear thin. "I don't care what they told you," she said, her voice now tinged with frustration. "I paid for this seat. It's mine, and I want you to get up and move." At that point, Jessica realized that reasoning with this man wasn't going to get her anywhere. She was done trying to be polite, trying to reason with someone who wasn't even listening. So with a sharp inhale, she turned toward the flight attendants. She needed someone who could handle this. Flight attendant Sarah appeared quickly, a practiced smile on her face. But even with her polished demeanor, Jessica could tell that Sarah was taken aback by the situation. She quickly glanced at the man in 3A, then back at Jessica, trying to assess the situation. "What seems to be the problem, Miss Davis?" Sarah asked, still smiling, but there was a slight hesitation in her voice. "This man," Jessica said, pointing at the man in 3A, "is sitting in my seat. I've paid for this seat. I confirmed it, and now I'm being told that he's been allowed to take it. I need him to move." The man, who had clearly been ignoring Jessica until now, finally looked up. He raised an eyebrow as if bemused by the whole situation. "Hey, I'm just doing what they told me," he muttered, his tone almost mocking. He turned back to his newspaper and began flipping the pages again. Sarah glanced back at Jessica. She seemed a little uncomfortable but quickly regained her professional composure. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Davis," she said, still maintaining a smile. "There seems to have been a reassignment of seats. I'll get it straightened out for you." Jessica didn't buy it. "Reassignment," she repeated, her voice sharpening. "What kind of reassignment? And why wasn't I told? I paid for this seat. I don't understand how a reassignment can just happen like this without any notice." Sarah hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Jessica's insistence. "The system automatically adjusted the seating," she said, though it didn't seem like she had any idea what she was talking about. "It was an internal issue, but I'll check with the flight manager and make sure we get this sorted." "Who authorized the change?" Jessica pressed, her patience running thin. "Who made the decision to take my seat and give it to this man? Because I'm not leaving until I know." The flight attendant's smile wavered slightly. "I'm not sure who authorized it," she admitted. "Let me check with the flight manager and get back to you." Jessica folded her arms, her frustration mounting. "I'd appreciate it if you did that quickly," she said, keeping her tone controlled but firm. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing into the cabin. Jessica stood there, her mind racing. A system error. It didn't add up. She had been assigned this seat, confirmed it, paid for it. There was no reason for someone else to be sitting in it, not unless someone had decided, without her knowledge, that her seat could be taken. But who would do that? And why? Jessica turned back to the man in 3A who was still sitting there like nothing had happened. He had stopped reading for a moment, his eyes glancing over the top of his paper, and he looked at Jessica with an almost smug expression. "So, what's the deal?" he asked. "Are we good now?" "We're far from good," Jessica replied, not bothering to hide her annoyance. "You shouldn't be in my seat, and until this is resolved, I'm not going anywhere." A few minutes later, Sarah returned, but this time she was accompanied by Flight Manager Mark, a tall, suited man who walked with an air of authority. Jessica didn't waste any time. "Thank you for joining us," Jessica said, her voice tight. "Now, I'd like some answers." Mark nodded but didn't immediately speak. His eyes briefly flickered over to the man in 3A who was still lounging comfortably in the seat. "Miss Davis," he said, addressing Jessica, "I understand there's a concern. Let me assure you that we're going to take care of this. There's just been a last-minute change." "A change? What kind of change?" Jessica asked, her voice raising slightly. "I booked this seat weeks ago, and now you're telling me it's been reassigned." "Yes," Mark said, glancing back at the man in 3A. "There was a request from a VIP, and the system automatically adjusted the seating." Jessica's eyebrows shot up. "A VIP? Who?" Mark hesitated, and Jessica could see the hesitation in his eyes. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information at the moment," he said, his tone polite but firm. Jessica clenched her jaw. This was starting to feel like a bad joke. "So, let me get this straight. A VIP, who you won't even name, requested a seat change, and now I'm supposed to just accept it." Mark took a step back as though unsure of how to proceed. "Miss Davis, I assure you this is highly unusual, but we'll make sure it's rectified. Please, just take your seat in the meantime and we'll work this out." Jessica wasn't convinced. "I want to know who authorized this. I want to know why this happened, and I want it fixed. I don't move until I get some answers." The man in 3A shifted slightly, his confidence now wavering just a little. The silence that followed was thick with tension as the reality of the situation started to sink in for him as well. Jessica stood firm, refusing to let it go. If this wasn't a mistake, if this wasn't just some random error, then someone had made a deliberate decision. And Jessica Davis wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. The tension in the air was thick. Jessica had been standing her ground for what felt like an eternity. Her body was tense, her arms crossed in front of her chest as she stood at the edge of the aisle, her eyes locked on Flight Manager Mark. He had arrived with a calm, composed air, but Jessica wasn't fooled. She could see the flicker of uncertainty behind his otherwise professional demeanor. The whole situation felt wrong, and she wasn't about to let it go until she had answers. Mark, tall and wearing a crisp navy suit, stopped just a few feet away from her. He had a polite, practiced smile on his face, but Jessica wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. She needed a resolution, and she needed it now. "Miss Davis, I understand there's a concern. Let me assure you we are going to resolve this," Mark said, his voice smooth and measured. "Concern," Jessica repeated, her voice sharp. "This isn't just a concern, Mark. I paid for a first-class seat, confirmed it weeks ago, and now some random man is sitting in it without a shred of explanation. This is a serious issue. So, how are you going to fix it?" Mark blinked, the polite smile still in place, but it was clear that Jessica's forceful tone had caught him off guard. He took a step closer and gestured for Jessica to take a seat, his voice lowering. "I understand your frustration, Miss Davis, but there has been a last-minute request for this seat from a VIP. A VIP?" Jessica's heart sank, and a surge of irritation washed over her. "You keep saying VIP, but you won't tell me who this VIP is. Why not? Who is it, Mark? Who is so important that they get to take my seat on a paid, confirmed reservation?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his composure. "I can't disclose that information. But I assure you, the change was made by the system automatically, and it was in response to a request from this VIP." He held his hands up in a calming gesture. "We're doing everything we can to resolve the situation. Please understand that it's not our usual procedure." Jessica's jaw clenched. She didn't want excuses. She wanted action. "I'm not buying it," she said, her voice unwavering. "I paid for this seat. I want to know who this VIP is, and I want to see their ticket right now. I'm not leaving this aisle until I get answers." Mark hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the pressure Jessica was applying. He looked down at the man still lounging in 3A, who had been quiet up until this point, watching the interaction unfold with a disinterested expression. Mark's eyes darted back to Jessica, his face betraying the slightest flicker of unease. "Miss Davis, I'm afraid I can't provide you with that information," he repeated, his voice more firm now. "As I said, this was a request from a VIP." Jessica wasn't satisfied. "So what you're telling me is that I'm supposed to accept that my seat was given away to someone else, without even knowing who they are or why they deserve it more than I do, just because you say so? That's your explanation?" She could feel the heat rising in her chest. This was absurd. She had been perfectly clear. She was not going to let the situation slide. Not when she knew something was off. And not when it was so evident that Mark wasn't being entirely truthful. The man in 3A, who had been silent through most of the exchange, now shifted in his seat, his posture changing as if he was beginning to realize that Jessica wasn't backing down. He folded his newspaper and looked up at Mark. "Look," he said, interrupting, "I'm not here to cause a scene. I was told to sit here. I don't know what's going on with her seat, but I was told this was my place." He shrugged nonchalantly, as if the whole thing didn't matter much to him. Jessica's patience snapped. She turned to face him directly, her eyes narrowing. "And you didn't think to question why you were sitting in someone else's seat. You're just going to sit there because they told you to. That's it." The man seemed taken aback, but instead of answering, he simply shrugged again and looked away. It was the look of someone who knew he was in the wrong but didn't care enough to do anything about it. Jessica let out a deep breath, turning back to Mark. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice cool but sharp. "This man, who is clearly not a VIP, is sitting in my seat because he asked for an upgrade and you just handed it to him. Is that what you're telling me?" Mark's expression faltered, and for the briefest moment, Jessica saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes. "It's not exactly like that, Miss Davis," he said, avoiding her gaze. "The system—" "No," Jessica interrupted, shaking her head. "It's exactly like that. You've taken my seat and you've allowed someone who didn't pay for it to take it. And now you're standing here telling me that it's all fine and dandy because the system made the change. I'm not accepting that." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She could see it in Mark's eyes now. The man in 3A wasn't a VIP at all. He was just a regular passenger who had asked for an upgrade and been given it without a second thought, without any real reason other than that he had asked. And somehow, in the process, Jessica's reservation had been ignored. She had been bumped for no reason other than that someone else had wanted her seat. Jessica wasn't about to let that slide. She had worked hard to get where she was in life, and she wasn't about to let an airline, any airline, treat her like she didn't matter. "Get him to move," she said, her voice steady but filled with an intensity that left no room for negotiation. "Now." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Jessica and the man in 3A. It was clear that he was weighing his options, trying to figure out how to handle the situation without causing a scene. But Jessica wasn't going to let him off the hook. "I don't care who you have to talk to or what kind of system error you have to explain," Jessica continued, her voice unwavering. "I paid for this seat and I'm getting it back, now, or I will call the airline's corporate office and make sure this issue is escalated. You can explain it to them." There was no hesitation in her tone. She meant every word. And this time, Jessica didn't care who was in charge. She wasn't going to let anyone steal her seat without consequences. Mark finally nodded, his shoulders stiff with reluctant compliance. He turned to the man in 3A, who was still sitting there, seemingly unaffected by the tension in the air. "I'm sorry, sir," Mark said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "but you'll need to move to another seat." The man in 3A opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. He sighed, clearly not willing to make a scene, and stood up without another word. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling a surge of triumph as she finally reclaimed her seat. She sat down slowly, her back straight as she glanced at Mark, her eyes cold. "Next time," she said, "don't make the mistake of thinking you can take what's mine." The silence in the cabin grew heavier as Captain Richard stepped into the scene. His crisp uniform and commanding presence immediately filled the space, causing all eyes to shift toward him. There was something about the way he carried himself that made it clear. He wasn't just any flight crew member. He was in charge. Jessica felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. This was it. She had been fighting for her seat for far too long, and now, it seemed, someone who held real authority was about to take charge. Captain Richard's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the tense interaction between Jessica, Mark, and the man in 3A. Without wasting a moment, he turned toward Jessica, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Davis, I understand there's been some confusion. I'm Captain Richard. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Jessica stood up straighter. She had been fighting for this moment, fighting for the truth, and now she wasn't about to back down. She glanced at the man in 3A who was still sitting there with an air of indifference. It seemed like he hadn't quite grasped the gravity of the situation. "Captain," Jessica began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I booked a first-class seat. I confirmed it weeks ago. When I got on this plane, I found this man in my seat, 3A. When I asked him to move, he said he had been told to sit here. He claims he was given permission, but nobody could explain why my seat was reassigned without my consent. And now here I am, being told I have to move because someone else apparently requested an upgrade." Captain Richard listened intently, nodding as Jessica spoke. He didn't interrupt her. Instead, he absorbed every word, his expression serious. When she finished, he turned to Mark, the flight manager, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mark," Captain Richard said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument, "I want you to check the man's ticket. Now." Mark hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the captain's command. He glanced briefly at the man in 3A, who was now squirming slightly in his seat, no longer as confident as he had been before. Mark seemed to weigh the situation for a moment before he nodded and moved to the front of the cabin to check the man's ticket. Jessica could see that Mark was reluctant, his posture stiff, but he knew better than to argue with the captain. As he worked quickly, Jessica felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been trying to make sense of the whole situation since she had first boarded the flight, and now it was all coming to a head. Would the captain actually get to the bottom of this? Minutes passed like hours, the quiet murmur of passengers filling the space as they waited for an outcome. Jessica's gaze remained fixed on the man in 3A, who was now avoiding eye contact, fiddling with his hands and staring out the window. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. Finally, Mark returned, holding the man's boarding pass in his hand. Captain Richard took it without a word, his eyes scanning it carefully. "I've checked," Mark said, his voice quieter now. "The passenger's ticket does not correspond to the seat he's occupying." Captain Richard's expression hardened as he looked up from the boarding pass. "So, what does that tell us?" Mark swallowed, clearly flustered. "It tells us that he didn't have the right to be sitting in 3A, he admitted, his voice now tinged with discomfort. "The system made the change, but it wasn't authorized by the right people." Jessica felt her heart race. The truth was finally coming to light. The man in 3A hadn't been a VIP at all. He hadn't even had the right to be sitting in her seat. It had all been a mistake. No, worse than that. A careless decision based on someone else's request for an upgrade. And now she was the one who had been bumped. The captain turned toward the man in 3A, his expression cold but composed. "Sir," he began, his voice stern, "you are occupying a seat that is not yours. You didn't book this seat, nor were you authorized to take it." The man in 3A shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes widening. It was clear that he was beginning to realize the seriousness of the situation. "But they told me I could sit here," he stammered, his voice shaky now. Captain Richard didn't flinch. "It doesn't matter who told you. This seat was booked and confirmed by another passenger, Miss Davis, who paid for it. I expect you to vacate the seat immediately." For a brief moment, the man hesitated. But when he saw the captain's unwavering gaze, he knew there was no point in arguing. With a sigh, he gathered his belongings and stood up. His shoulders slumped in defeat as he slowly moved out of the aisle. Jessica couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph as the man left her seat. She had been pushed aside, dismissed, and ignored, but now she had her seat back. She didn't need to say anything. The truth had been revealed, and the justice she had fought for was finally in her grasp. The man awkwardly shuffled down the aisle, his eyes downcast as he made his way to the back of the plane. The passengers around him seemed to watch with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction, their murmurs quieting as he disappeared from view. Jessica took a moment to breathe. Her pulse was still racing, but she allowed herself a small victory. She had stood her ground, refused to let anyone take advantage of her, and in the end, it had paid off. Captain Richard turned back to her, his expression softening. "Miss Davis, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his tone sincere. "We don't typically have these kinds of issues, and I assure you we will take steps to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jessica gave him a small nod. "Thank you," she said simply. She appreciated the captain's intervention, but she wasn't going to forget how this had happened in the first place. As Jessica settled back into her rightful seat, she glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were returning to their own business, but she could feel their eyes on her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She had made a statement. She had stood up for what was right, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. As Jessica sank back into her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. She had reclaimed her spot in first class, her seat that she had paid for, the seat she rightfully deserved. But the sense of satisfaction that should have come with the victory wasn't there. Instead, there was a quiet sense of unresolved frustration that gnawed at her. The man who had taken her seat was gone, and the captain had apologized, but none of that erased the reality of what had happened. Jessica wasn't just upset about the seat. It wasn't just about a physical spot on an airplane. It was about the fact that she had been treated like she didn't matter. And it was about the fact that the system had been allowed to make this decision without any accountability. She had been pushed aside without any explanation, just because someone else had asked for what was hers. But Jessica was no stranger to fights. She had built her career from the ground up, navigating a world that often underestimated her, dismissing her because of her gender and race. She had faced countless battles before. This one, she realized, was just a symptom of something much larger. It was part of a pattern, a system that allowed people like her to be overlooked and ignored. How many others had been in her position? How many others had quietly accepted being treated unfairly because they thought they didn't have the power to fight back? How many people had been brushed aside, made to feel small, just because they didn't have the means to speak up? That thought hit her like a wave. Jessica's eyes narrowed as she glanced around the cabin. The other passengers had returned to their own world, quietly reading, chatting, or staring out the window. It was easy to assume that no one cared, but Jessica knew better. She knew that this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about one seat being taken. This was about a culture of complacency, a culture where people were too scared or too tired to stand up for themselves, where a mistake or an oversight could turn into an unfair system that people were expected to accept without question. Her pulse quickened as she pulled out her phone. She wasn't just going to sit here and let it go. She wasn't going to let the airline sweep this under the rug as a one-time mistake. She was going to make sure that this got addressed properly. She wasn't just fighting for her seat anymore. She was fighting for every passenger who had been treated like they didn't matter. She opened her messaging app and typed out the words she had been thinking all through this ordeal. The message was simple, but the weight of it carried more than just her frustration. It carried the message of accountability, of standing up for what was right. Dear, I am writing to express my deep concern and disappointment over a recent experience I had on flight from New York to Los Angeles. I had booked and confirmed my seat in first class, only to find upon boarding that my seat was occupied by another passenger. When I questioned the situation, I was told that the seat had been reassigned due to a last-minute request from a VIP. However, upon further investigation, it was revealed that this individual was not a VIP, but simply a passenger requesting an upgrade. This situation is more than just a seating mix-up. It's a glaring example of how passengers are treated without respect and without proper accountability. The system allowed for my seat to be taken without any valid explanation or notice to me, and this kind of oversight is unacceptable. I am not just asking for an apology for myself. I am asking for a serious review of your procedures to ensure that no other passenger experiences the same treatment. This was an issue of fairness, and I want to make sure that your company addresses it properly to prevent future occurrences. No one should have to fight for what they've paid for, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as a seat on a flight. Please take immediate steps to address this issue and ensure that future passengers are treated with the respect and consideration they deserve. Thank you, Jessica Davis. Jessica read over the message, her fingers hovering over the send button. There was no hesitation. She pressed it. As the message was sent, Jessica leaned back in her seat and took a deep breath. It was done. She had spoken her truth, and now it was out there. She didn't know what the airline would do, if anything, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silently suffering under a system that let people like her get pushed aside. She glanced out of the window, watching the lights of the city twinkle beneath her. The plane was beginning its descent, and Jessica's thoughts were already turning toward what came next. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. The system that had allowed her to be treated like this would not be able to ignore her now. She had opened a door, and she intended to make sure it stayed open. The airplane began its slow descent as Jessica reflected on the next steps. This wasn't just a battle about an empty seat. It was about what the seat represented, the voice of those who were often overlooked, the people who didn't have the power to speak up and demand better. The fight wasn't just about being treated fairly in a moment of inconvenience. It was about changing a culture, about challenging a system that had existed far too long without scrutiny. Jessica knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Never stay silent when faced with injustice, she thought, her heart steady. Always fight to change the system. This story wasn't just about one seat, it was about fairness. It was about demanding respect, not only for herself but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. She smiled to herself, knowing that her voice had been heard, even if only by one person at a time. And that was enough. For now.